Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 961st New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs at the Brooklyn Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Candice Lin and Andrew Woolbright. We're thrilled to welcome poet Larissa Pham here to close today's program. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Candice Lin is known for multimedia installations that incorporate transitive materials and transformative substances that signal the porous nature of boundaries. Her work engages notions of gender, race, and sexuality, drawing from decolonial theory, anthropology, natural history, and feminist and queer theory. And our host today, artist, curator, and critic Andrew Woolbright, is based in Brooklyn and is an MFA graduate from RISD in painting. He's the founder and director of the gallery Below Grand, located on the Lower East Side in New York. And we are lucky to have him as an editor-at-large at the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Andrew.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm so thrilled and excited to get to talk to Candice about this show. I think I've been talking everyone's ear off about how wonderful this show was. So I'm so happy this got put together, and I hope you're all having a great night or a great afternoon wherever you're tuning in from. If we could, I think we're ready to get into the slides. And so, Candice, I wanted to first, before we get into talking about this show and all of its complexity, I wanted to ask you, just because I like doing this with an artist, especially with an artist with so many layers and moves within your practice, how education has influenced your practice, or if it still does. What's your background in coming to art? Did you work with anyone, or did the schools you went to influence you? And I've noticed that you have a background in semiotics, and I'm wondering if that still plays a role in how you're thinking about form. Hi, Candice.
Hi. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Chloe. Thanks everyone for being here. Yeah, I like that question as an educator myself. I grew up without that much exposure to art. Like I never went to museums or saw contemporary art. So I think, yeah, being exposed to it in college was like when I first kind of started to think about its role in society and what it would mean to be an artist beyond loving to make things. My semiotics degree was really just a ploy because my parents were pretty clear that they didn't want me to waste their money getting a degree in art. So I double majored as a kind of compromise, even though a second degree in art semiotics is probably just as useless to them. But I think it does, that degree at Brown University is very much about thinking about the meaning of like signs and decoding stories and like understanding how meaning kind of flows within like objects and images. And so that is something that I still carry in terms of like how I make art, how I analyze stories that I read about or hear about or news or anything. I think in terms of like thinking about educators that influenced me in undergrad, I had a professor of sculpture, Richard Fishman, who had a lot of really inventive uses of organic materials in his own sculptures. He actually introduced me to kombucha scobies way back. This is like 97 or whatever, way back before it wasn't like a thing that people were thinking about. And in grad school, I had a professor, Stephanie Ellis, who really got me to value and develop my writing in relationship to my practice. And that I feel like is something that I've kind of returned to in this work, Lithium, Sex, Demons in the Factory. The writing actually was like a big starting point for the installation. Yeah, and then I continue to, have mentors and people that have influenced me outside of the kind of educational sphere as well.
Amazing. I mean, I would love to hear more about that, but maybe a little later because we've got these incredible images already popping up to look at. This is the first thing you you see when you walk into the gallery, these stations, these worker stations, this frog screen computer in front of what's kind of like a supervisor's platform, or like overlooking everything, or that's how I interpreted it. And going back to this idea of decoding, which I still very much see in your work, it seems in the past materials have been the entry point, and this one was more about this thing you came across, or this information. How did it feel? How does it feel knowing you've done both, I guess? Like, how did it feel starting with like this event that maybe you can get into of what's happening in lithium factories, as opposed to like material, or which came first?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, this one is kind of a weird hybrid. So I feel like from about 2015, for a couple years after that, I had a way that I was doing a research-based approach where I would kind of focus on a single material and then research the kind of colonial or global trade histories of it and the way it was entangled with issues of violence, or, histories of labor and extraction. And then I think during the pandemic, there was a little bit of a shift for me for the piece I did for the Walker Art Center and Harvard Carpenter Center that traveled to Banff, which was a big indigo tent and had a lot of cats in it.
Mhm.
And I think there was a shift to storytelling, to humor, to not take away from the kind of history of indigo, which I was looking at and had intended to kind of go forward in the way I had been working. But in a way, that shift kind of just came intuitively for my own like emotional well-being and trying to survive things and needing that play within there as an approach. And then for this work, I was thinking about lithium as a material that I wanted to like continue to research. It came up for me in my role as faculty at UCLA, where I'm in the ceramics area. And so when we buy materials for the lab, I was just struck by the kind of huge increase in the price of lithium that came out of the battery production for alternative energy. And I was thinking about that in relationship to other things I knew about lithium's use for medical reasons, and other issues that had come up with like the Salton Sea being a site that nearby in California that is a place that people are thinking of extracting lithium. So I was thinking on the one hand, sorry, I'm being very long-winded.
No.
I was thinking on the one hand about lithium as a material similar to how I'd thought about cochineal or indigo or sugar or porcelain in my past work. And then simultaneously was thinking about the history of the production of it in factories. I had, speaking of influences, I'm also like often influenced by my students and conversations and things that I learn from them and my friends. So I had a conversation with a dear friend of mine, Miljan Ruperto, who's like a brother to me. We just argue like siblings all the time. And he and Stania Khan had actually made a piece I never saw until like a couple weeks ago about these factories of electronics that were in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, where the workers, who were primarily Asian women, were getting possessed. And part of that may have been actual physical health effects of the kind of conditions of work, but also a kind of cultural understanding of that effect, right, in the body and spirit. And so they was causing all these disruptions in the factories. And Aiwa Ong is somebody who's a Berkeley professor who's written about it. So I kind of forgot that like Miljan and I had talked about this thing he was working on with Stania years ago. And then I was in conversation with a grad student of mine, Anne Hae-young, who's an amazing artist. And she was researching it from a different context, coming from her work around labor. And then I was like, oh yeah, Miljan and Stania made a piece about that. And then I started thinking about it, and I read Aiwa Ong's book then. And I did try to kind of acknowledge all four, I guess, of those kind of influences in the space of the installation on the wall credit. Because I feel like, yeah, and going back, so I'm kind of jumping back to your old question around like influences. I think we're always making work influencing each other. And I think this like myth of the individual artist, like sometimes like forgets to talk about how we're in conversations, right? So it came out of that. And I wanted to create my own kind of possessed factory that talked about like contemporary manufacturing of like sources of power with the lithium batteries. And then from that, knowing that the story kind of started being written, or I started writing the story. I just said it like that.
Yeah.
The demons made me write it. And I think I just kind of developed some of the visuals from kind of imagining it as I wrote the story.
Awesome. That's wonderful. I mean, this might be a good place. I pulled a quote from your writing, and I also really loved your text that you wrote. It's a beautiful work in itself that you incorporate so well. Lithium, the humans dredge it up from dead oceans buried under deserts of sand. They take the sea's bones and crush them into a power that stores energy. Like, I mean, getting into that complexity of dealing with it like you dealt with cochineal, you really are thinking of it literally, but then poetically, and then shifting to how does this take form. I'm wondering, just like in a practical question, like you said, the writing came first, but what was the first kind of decision you made in terms of the form this took sculpturally or as objects? Was it the stations, or did you think of the platform, or what was the entry point into how this thing manifested itself?
Well, okay, let me back up from that a sec. So like that quote that you read, I was thinking a lot about, well, a lot of the things, like a lot of times when I think about materials, I'm thinking about them in relationship to the body. So like I had made a previous work where I was thinking about bone black pigment and the way that some of the Chinese indentured laborers' bones were turned into bone charcoal and used to refine sugar. So this kind of like use of the body literally in a kind of act of violence and industrialization. And so I was thinking about like the lithium as connected to like oil, and oil being this kind of like body from the past that we're using, and then lithium itself also serving that purpose and being also in my story a kind of time traveling device because of the way that it like slows time for humans in the neurons, which is why it's used kind of for bipolar. And so I think in trying to tie that into like how I conceived of the exhibition, like in pragmatic terms, I think whenever I think about like objects in space, I'm thinking about this kind of experiential feeling I want to create in the body, because so much of like the material concern I have is also about this kind of use of the body in like all these different forms. So I started, I think, not thinking about workstations or manager platform, but about a cave. And maybe because like the story started for me from a dream, which was very physical and very palpable when I woke up from it. And in the dream, I was inside this mountain, inside this cave, and I was next to this corpse. And I had this kind of moment of confusion in the cave. And I remember the feeling of being like, oh, wait, is that corpse me? What is this? What am I doing here? What is this? Like, and like somehow when I woke up, there was just the feeling of all these presences in the room with me. And I knew that I wanted to create some, as I like wrote the story to figure out what that was about. I wanted to recreate that feeling of the underworld, or the like feeling of having this like, oh, there was also like this pulsing sound in the dream that was like going through my body as I like was in confusion in this dark cave. So the red lit part underneath the manager's platform maybe is like viscerally what started the piece for me, but I didn't know yet that it would be like underneath the manager's platform. I just knew that I wanted to create something that created that feeling.
I have so many questions that I wrote down about that red light. That red light was so wondrous to me, of like what did that platform. I guess this would be a good point to jump in. I mean, how do you think of it? Do you think of it as like a reperformance of magic or a reperformance of the dream? Or do you think of it as like an actual, I mean, do you invite the language of magic itself? Because like when I was in this space, I've gone to the show multiple times. There's part of me that's like, this is the language of sculpture and the language of art. And then there's also a part of me that's like, this is the language of like something happening on an like beneath the surface underground from a dream space, like that body vibration passing through your body. Is that too woo woo, or do you like that? There's like, do you invite the mysticism and magic as a literal language, or is it about performing that feeling you felt in the dream?
I have no problem with woo woo.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, no, I believe in that. I think I always talk about it more through the aspect of haunting, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But I think people use the word magic or mysticism to talk about the effects of social haunting. So yeah, for me, I want it to be a way that I can translate this thing that I felt pass through my body and was connected to history. And I want it to like come into the present and like be an experience that's felt and then haunts other people.
Yeah.
And like when I say that, I don't mean that in like a negative way. I guess I'm thinking of like Avery Gordon's Ghostly Matters book, where she's talking about creating a space for hospitality for ghosts, with the intention of like justice in some way, or some reckoning with this kind of unacknowledged sociological repressed aspect that haunts us because it like is returning in the form from not being kind of acknowledged or reckoned with. So I guess I mean haunting in that kind of way, haunting with stakes, not like haunting to like just fuck with people.
Yeah. I mean, wonderful. I mean, I think that's like, for me, this is also me getting into like a specific type of language and question I have, which is like, there's a part of me that interpreted the show as almost like a kind of Bataille surrealism, that there's like it has stakes, like you said. You're starting with like a real cultural trauma, a real site of wound, and then I don't know, does it feel appropriate to say like building a world outside of it, or worlding, or world making, or mythologizing? Like, how do you think about, I guess, this project in terms of that? Like, do you feel comfortable as like a world builder as a sculptor, or like how do you feel about that language?
I'm not sure. Like I think I feel like it is a term that has been used.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I definitely like have a vivid imagination that's, in some way comes out of places I can't necessarily locate, and then other times is clearly connected to real history or real things in my lives. Yeah, I mean, I guess that it's world building in a sense that there's a mythological, speculative aspect to the work. It's not like didactically tied to research or like factual history alone. And part of that is because like there are limits to what we can actually know, so there's a role for speculation. But I guess I wouldn't want it to like be seen as just like some weird artist fantasy that's unconnected from the politics and history that it comes out of.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly doesn't for me, or it didn't for me. It doesn't feel disconnected or total fantasy. I guess really what the question is, and maybe this is too, you know, wanting to know too much, but I like this idea of like using it to externalize the haunting or like implicate the viewer in the haunting. But going away from the research to this subjectivity, like this scene that we have that we're looking at right now, your paintings of cats, like the humor that you bring in, like the I guess like the lost in translation, or the moments where it stops being a research paper and starts being art. I'm wondering if how you're thinking about that as far as like what you're trying to do to the audience. Is it implicating them or spending more time with this idea of what happens to bodies in lithium factories, or is it an empathy exchange? Or yeah, how are you thinking about that? Or is that
Um,
trying to know too much?
I mean, I think it's open. Like I wouldn't be disappointed if it had many different ways it sat with people.
Mm,
And it's not a diatribe on labor politics and lithium battery factories. And the kind of angst of the queer story within this kind of Asian context is also like really important and deeply
mm,
personal. Um, and a part of what I would hope comes across beyond like the issue of kind of factory labor. Um,
mm. I'm wondering, going off of that, where you see yourself in the work, because there's a part of me was like, is Candice the claymation cat in the animated videos, or is Candice, what I liked about it is just when it kind of gets into that world building language, then you look at the workstations and there are all these invoices from down the street of where the materials came from, and there's your notes that it took to install and make this thing. So it's like there is some confusion that's very playful or critical of yourself in the factory too, or seeing yourself in that. Is that fair to say?
yeah, for sure. No, I was super embarrassed when I wrote the story because it felt too like I'm getting embarrassed just thinking about it. It felt too
Sorry.
revealingly like very personal that I am that cat demon.
Hmm. I mean, I think it's the most interesting avatar I've come across. I think that it's allowing you to create something self-deprecating, but also heroic, and really, I don't know, I really related to it.
Hmm.
I mean, like, but going back to it, like you including so much of the language that took to make the show in the show, like how are you thinking of that move, for that maneuver? Like, is it equating the artist with, like there's something in the process that opens yourself up to demons? Is it that literal of a metaphor, or I'm really curious about that choice. It's a
Wait,
great one.
say it again. You mean like, can you clarify, like putting the documents of the making of the show into the office boxes?
Yes, exactly. Like literally, like I took a few notes. There's one that was like two more pneumatic fittings. There's like a sticky note. There's like temperature set to 100 degrees note. It felt like there were notes that were actually where to order and place these
Mhm.
sculptures.
Mm, I mean, I think I didn't think that much about it. I thought it was funny.
Yeah.
Um, but like I wasn't trying to be like, oh, making art is like a factory or something. I don't know.
Mhm.
I don't have anything I stand behind on that.
Mhm.
I think I was more just yeah, I was like, I knew I wanted there to be a a playfulness and a like honesty around like how like notes and workstations are, and like so some of them have post-it notes that are actually related to how the stations should be read in terms of a storytelling device. Like I can't think of an example now, but like this station is about this limbo space, or this one is about the confrontation between um the exorcist, and then
Mhm.
and what does that mean culturally, um and then other ones are like buy two more pens for the station, or
Yeah.
um and we kept some of the ones from when the work was first shown at Gwangju as well, so there's actually like a kind of accumulation of the making in some of the notes that are kept and shown. And then somebody on at the pre-opening, I think, even like wrote on the on one of the Post-it notes. And they were like, oh no, somebody graffitied it, should we take it away? And I was like, no, I think it's funny, let's just leave it. And I don't know if that got added to at all during the run of the show or not, but yeah.
That's amazing. I didn't notice a change in writing style or the language, but I love knowing that. I mean, I think that like a lot of your work is thinking about a virtual space through like animation and video, and then a physical space, and kind of traversing back and forth between those. And this one seemed to really be about that land of the living, land of the dead. But how are you thinking about it like formally? Like, are you making the sculptures first and then making the animation as a response, or is it all being done at the same time or built at the same time?
I think it's different in different cases. In this one, the story came first and actually like kind of took too long. And then I felt a little rushed in making some of the physical parts. And let's see, the story came, yeah, the animations were happening pretty shortly after I wrote the story. And then I had drafts of like how I wanted the workstations and the manager's platform to look, which were constrained in the Gwangju version by a lot of like museum rules. And so there were a lot of compromises. So this version at Canal Projects is the only version that like feels like it matches like the kind of vision of it from the beginning. And then the panels came last because I wanted, after I like was thinking about it more, I was like, I wanted there to be more this kind of feeling of enclosure or cave likeness, but they weren't part of the original plan. So I don't know if that answers what you're saying, but it's I guess it's somewhat intuitive, and it's all kind of evolving at the same time. With the animations, I don't animate the CGI part myself. I work with this artist, Yotam Mendelevi. And so a lot of it is like, has to get done. Like the story had to get done because I needed to create the animatics and the drawings to give him to be in conversation around how that gets shaped. Yeah.
I mean, can we talk about the style of the animation? Like I liked it too, and there's a virtual reality piece that you did in another show, but it kind of has this claymation feel to it, or this like I think there's like a visual humor at play. Like I'm wondering how you're thinking about the style of it. How is this a point of like ironic tension of funny and dramatic, like this tortured cat falling through a cave, but kind of in like oh no Gumby animation, you know?
Yeah. So I used to make a lot of claymation and stop motion animation on my own, and the kind of move to CGI with the help of Yotam was more just like limits of time. So you are kind of accurate to locate that like gooey plastic body that's in there is kind of related to this older kind of claymation kind of reference. And you asked if it's a deliberate, what did you say? Deliberate?
Oh, I assume everything. I mean, I think there's so much intentionality with this show. I mean, I guess I'm saying is how do you think of it in terms of like humor, or maybe like this is like part of where you're expressing like fluidity or like a non-constraint that this figure has the ability to take other forms or shapes. Or I guess that's kind of like how I interpreted that move of like, and then also like seeing the fingers pressing into the skin and changing it, you know?
Wait, which part?
I mean, like the just in the style of it, like I know it's a CGI model, but like I like that it has the look of like hand finger touch manipulation of like pushing into it, and like going back to that original thing you said of like the material as a body, or the material that relates to a body, like making these things. Like I love this tragic comic scene.
Yeah, also it's literally made from clay and then it's digitally scanned. So it's probably also an artifact of the way it's made, that it has the literal finger pushed into it.
Wow.
And yeah, so I don't know why I'm having a hard time answering this one. I don't know.
Hmm.
I think it isn't that conscious, maybe. Like it is pretty congruent to like life in my head. And I mean the
Mhm.
sounds are all me too. So it's
Yeah.
like also very it feels like just a a weird cartoon version of my head or my life. And so it's hard to respond to like it as a strategic thing or
Mhm.
what's it doing it because it's like it's just doing dum, 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 I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I love that. I mean, I think that going off that question, I don't take these as strategies, or I love hearing that it is just like trusting your own subjectivity because it's a wonderful subjectivity. I guess the other question I have, maybe it's appropriate for now. This started with a dream of you seeing a body and not knowing if it was yours, or is that typically how your dreams are, or what are your dreams like? Do they have any relationship to your practice typically, or do you draw from it often?
um I used to have really vivid dreams. I feel like I that dream I had when I was up at Banff Art Center doing a residency, and that place
Mm.
is like surrounded in a ring of mountains, so you always like have really vivid dreams there, or one does, I think. I do. Um, but yeah, like I feel like, I mean, as a kid, I used to have a really hard time separating. Like I would see things other people didn't see, like people and things. Um,
Mm.
and I think, you know, as life has gotten busier, like I make less room for dreaming, but it's obviously, I think when you make art, you're tapping that same place of your psyche that's open to things that are, I believe, beyond yourself. Um,
Mm.
so it is an indicative of like, yeah, my dream world, but also like a, a, a deeper level of psyche in general that is unconscious and related to dream world, even if I don't specifically um, use my dreams in like my work, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. I mean, a lot of times I just have
Totally.
anxiety dreams about, oh, my cat has been like locked in a basement for 2 years and I didn't know, and thought he I thought he was okay and he's so hungry, you know, the usual
Yeah.
banal worries.
Right. I I I love asking that question because I mean, I asked, this is probably private, but it's also not because it's on YouTube. But I asked Hito Steyerl that question, and she said that she dreams about grading papers for students at this point. And I think that there's something to be said about, or there seems to be a certain track that we take as artists where we have really vivid, incredible dreams. And then at some point, our practice kind of becomes this place to have those dreams when we just have anxiety. Oh, did I get to that student's paper on time? Dreams, which I like that dream space is now in the gallery space, or you're putting that out. I think that's cool.
Thank you.
Are there any shows that I'm so interested too to like return to this and like embracing it as a language of sculpture? Are there any shows that are really formative to you over the years, or like exhibitions you saw, or museum shows, maybe when you're a student at Brown or San Francisco Art Institute, or more recently that really challenged the way you think of how sculpture takes up space?
Um, yeah, I had a hard time thinking of specific. Also, I have a really bad memory, so I was having a hard time remembering. I mean, I could think
Mm.
of recent things, like I saw Shirley this show at Guggenheim that was amazing. Uh,
Mhm.
I recently at Venice, I saw the brain, the human, what was it called? The human brain at the Pratt collection that I really loved the
Mhm.
way that storytelling was interwoven with these historical objects, where this like, I think he's famous. I didn't know who he was. This old guy would come and read like a little passage from a short text they had commissioned from these writers.
Mhm.
Like one was by Salman Rushdie about or something, like the word for dreaming. And it was
Mhm.
next to a cuneiform tablet about dreams. So that mix of storytelling and historical objects, and then more like art objects and cultural objects mixed together, I loved. It was also set in this like very dimly lit maze, which I also really loved because I like things that really make you feel the experience of it. Oh, I remember this was a long time ago. This was shortly after moving to LA. I saw Apichatpong's work at Red Cat, and it was an installation, and also my introduction into his work. And I feel like his films and seeing that work and the way that he kind of like, there's both like a openness and non-authorship that lets layers of history and mythology and current politics and relations between people and queerness to like be in this murky but very emotionally moving space that I love about his work, and that I would aspire to wish that my work could do something like that.
I mean, I think it does. I mean, I that opens up a question I wanted to get to or ask with you, which is I do think that this sculpture seems like kind of imply a stage without making a stage, or it's like it has an element of set design or an element of like this is the atmosphere where an affect takes place or a vibe takes place. I'm wondering how much you think about like creating like part of the set versus the whole thing, or like the role of the fragment, I guess, within all of this. Because I think that was like really remarkable for me, is like just how an arrangement of those workstations implied a factory with like so few moves.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes like that's been more a condition of like money than like deliberate. Like, would if I had limitless money, would I have made a whole factory? I'm not sure. But I didn't. So I was like, how do I create a feeling that is, you know, like a reference to a factory, but obviously one that's like shifted, not like it's not trying to actually make you think that you've stepped into something the way a set maybe is. It's more like you're stepping almost into like an allegory of it or something. And then the manager's platform, I always wanted it to be this kind of like, I didn't want it to feel like, oh, you are now implicated in being in the position of power or something. Like I wanted it to feel like an uncomfortable space. Like the one in Gwangju, the ceiling is just above 5 feet for shorter audiences. And like this sense of claustrophobia, the sense of destabilization with the holes cut in the ground and the resonating sound coming up through the floor and the lights going on and off, so that you kind of, you're both like sometimes looking down and surveilling, but then sometimes you're like kind of in a fishbowl and being on view. Because I don't quite know why, except that like I don't ever want to make work where power feels easy and clear cut. Like I think for me, I'm interested more a lot of times in like a lot of like visual stuff that I've looked at, like objects and patterns are around these kind of moments of negotiation between like a moment of colonialism where one culture is kind of like dominating another, and what kind of imagery comes out of that, or like these moments of contestation, and that rather than it being like a clear metaphor around like those sitting up here are like bad and they did this to the workers or something. And that's really just comes from my own personal, what I find interesting to think about. And I think
well,
yeah, I think a lot about being implicated too as like the artist and an artist specifically with this, you know, background or whatever. And yeah, so yeah, you had asked something earlier about implicating audiences, and I think that's in there, but it's also like within the like all of us being implicated within it.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that that hesitancy to like moralize, which is like, yeah, if you walk up to the platform, then you're the supervisor, the manager. But then it's like, it's funny you said that. Like you do have the I had the weird feeling of being like, is this allowed for me to be up here? And like just the holes in the floor and being like, how much of life is cordoned off that you can't get near the thing to that you could fall through. And I was just like, yeah, I have to watch my step up here. But then going back to the factory floor and navigating that, seeing you kind of LARP or perform through a worker, but also like a dreamer, and also the cat as like this avatar. Like it's never one position. It's like an empathy with many different positions. And I think that's one of the reasons I keep sending students to see your show and talking about it, is that it's like it's seeing yourself in every role and character within this. It's like a video game that you can play as every character instead of like you're the protagonist as one. I guess there's not a question in that. I just really appreciated it. Um, I mean, I also wonder like how you think of like I do think of your work relating to being totally its own subjectivity, but having a relationship to this sculptor as a type of ethnographer, like finding an interesting event and building it out, you know, like Calfe with cosplay or Carrie Upson with like her Larry project. I'm wondering if there are any sculptors that you feel connected to, or like a type of practice of like an open floor plan or an array that you're thinking about, or feel like you relate to beyond yourself.
I mean, I think a lot of it is, I mean, like some of the artists I mentioned, like Apichatpong or Shirley Tse, um, and then a lot of like my friends who are artists, I feel like I learn from and resonate with their practices.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know that I have like a model of sculpture or
Mm-hmm.
like a way of working. I don't, in terms of like the sculptor or artist as ethnographer, um, and I think lots of artists play with that role that subvert this kind of assumed distance or objectivity
Mm-hmm.
one could have in that. And um, so, yeah, I don't personally maybe think about that in my own work or my own role, but I also
Mm-hmm.
don't, I think the parts of that approach, um, which what am I trying to say? The parts of that approach that feel like problematic in terms of like a false objectivity or a distance you can't actually have are addressed
Mm-hmm.
in many artists' ways of being artist ethnographers. So, but I don't personally ever think of myself in relationship to that. Although I did spend a lot of time in my early work thinking about the history of anthropology and ethnography, but more just as like a fascinating discipline and how it got formed and wanting to learn about that.
Something that came up in reading past interviews with you was this word synecdoche, and I think as a relationship to semiotics, or like the fragment that implies the whole, and your relationship of that to uh, gender and identity, and like queer love and safety, and creating a non-patriarchal space. I'm wondering if you could expand that or talk a little bit more about that? Because I found that so interesting. And if that's still relating to this body of work or this show.
I don't know how it relates to synecdoche. I always say that word wrong. I was like synecdoche, or it's like a weird
I
word.
might be saying it
No,
wrong.
you're saying it right. You're
It's
saying it right. I
okay.
like have a lot of words I say wrong. I guess like I don't know how to respond to it as a part of a whole, but I think a lot of times I'm interested in fleshing out these micro worlds that maybe exist in resistance to or alongside a dominant thing that doesn't necessarily make room for them. So I think this installation, there are parts of this installation that are full of almost like a melancholic yearning. And I think that comes from, in the story, you know, this kind of haunting is in part the kind of capitalist structure, but it's also in part like the main yellow cat demon, who's not me at all,
Yeah.
ends up dying because they're trying to make a life where their queer future is possible, right? By stealing money and then like they fell into this machine. And stealing batteries, sorry, to sell for money. And so I'm kind of losing my track, but like I think what I'm trying to do in the installation is to both create like a feeling of understanding of what that particular struggle feels like within that story in that context, and also like the love and tenderness and yearning and all the emotion that's within that hidden microcosm, to have that like in the space, as well as like the kind of inability for it to come to fruition, or the kind of violence of it's being cut short.
Is it fair to say, I mean, I feel like that's a pretty real theme throughout your work for a while now, which is like using sculpture to take like a single sentence or a single line of an essay or a single line of like a anthropological document and try to dimensionalize it. Take a statistic of women and give them a poetics or a life outside of it, or imagine that. Is that fair to say that that's something you've been doing for a while now?
Yeah, I think that's a good read of it. Yeah, like I think about the early work I was telling you about. This is work right out of grad school that was looking at the history of anthropology and ethnography. That was called The Sexual Lives of Savages, which came from the Malinowski text and was really trying to look at how, you know, all these kind of projections, racist projections kind of like form a discipline, or like form a structure of a discipline, and like what else could we imagine outside of a kind of Anglo-Euro framework, if we like kind of speculated within from a different angle. And then work I did on looking at scientist Lynn Margulis's theories of coevolution took her a line from an interview she did where she was talking about coevolution and new cellular forms coming from this moment where one being cannot make another reducible to itself by digesting it or destroying it. And she called that the long-lasting intimacy of strangers. And her theories were always kind of written about in this very simplified way as being a kind of answer to neo-Darwinism. And I was just really interested in like thinking about what does that mean, in not a romanticized way necessarily, but also a way that is fraught with a lot of other feelings. Like there's violence within coevolution too. So yeah, I guess, yeah, I don't know to what end, but yeah, I think I am often like thinking about things I read or phrases of things that stick with me and trying to like imagine what the other viewpoint or world is that it could come from.
I love that. I think maybe it's a good place to end and open it up to audience questions, because it was kind of what I was hoping would be the answer getting through is like the protection that comes from that coevolution, like the way that you entangle your own story into it brings dimensionality to a story that is only told as a sentence or two. Like, I think that bringing yourself into it is a shield to that story, but also a way to shine light on it, and a way of building a poetics to it. And I just think it's an incredible project. One of the few things that I believe art has a type of political agency. Like, I think of Bell Hooks' essay talking about a photograph that we never get to see, but she's describing it. And like, how do you have how do you deal with that editorial patriarchal thing of dealing with information that's not there, and how do you build a record where there isn't one? And I love that you're able to do that and make it humorous and tragicomic and so many other things within your work. And thank you for putting together such a wonderful show, Candice. It's really been great talking to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much for your good questions. I'm sorry, I feel like I kind of sometimes I get
You're
flustered, can't find the right thoughts.
I stunned and overwhelmed by the complexity of the work and your answers. It was incredible. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Andrew and Candice, so much for that incredibly generous dialogue. We do have a couple of questions. If you have a question and you haven't asked it in the chat, please feel free to do so. And I will be sure to ask your question on your behalf, or I can pass you the virtual mic to ask directly. The first question is from Ashwini. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, in the audience. Loving the conversation. Thank you both. Candice, I haven't seen this show, but experienced the Bamfa show. There's a sense of permeability within the multiverse you create. Wondering how you respond to this idea of permeability.
Yeah, I think I usually call it porosity, but that's kind of the same idea. And I think a lot of my work, especially the like sensorial and experiential parts I try to emphasize in how people receive them, is around trying to think of what we get when we reframe and we don't think about ourselves as these kind of self-enclosed individuals, but as beings with porous borders that, are entangled with and like composed of others. So whether that's through the lens of like some kind of scientific theory that I'm looking at, or whether it's through like specific cases of toxic pollutants in the environment that have like queer effects, and what does that mean, or whether that's through colonial histories of materials. I think there is that's a really wise observation that, yeah, it is really important to me to think about these kind of like moments of entanglement, and also that to go back to like some of the things I was trying to say around not articulating a clear categorization of power, is also like this rejection of purity or like authenticity, or that there can ever be this moment of like looking from without being implicated. And I think that's very much about permeability.
Thank you so much for that answer, Candice. And thank you for that question, Ashwini. I had a question just come in through the chat that I'll ask from Deb Clark. As I listened to your cave dream, to confusion about the corpse, to lithium, to the process for this factory, I'm wondering if you're framing your answer to your initial confusion with the added dimension of chaos theory, as in feedback loops to that initial dream?
I don't know what chaos theory is exactly.
Okay.
So, does
Deb, if you want to frame your question or add more context, feel free to do so. While you're doing that, I'm going to ask my question, which is the third question. Candice, I'm curious if you can talk a bit about the role of surveillance in the work. I found the manager's office to be such an interesting aspect of the installation and that idea of surveillance, and sort of the relationship it sets up to the rest of the workstations, and also the spare nature of the manager's office. And so I was curious to hear you speak a bit more about that context.
Okay. So we did talk a little bit about it already in terms of like my intentions around it being this kind of thing that flips between being the observer versus observed. It's meant to be a heady space that's also a space that's like claustrophobic and destabilizing. It's meant to be spare, so that you're just kind of, it's whittled down to just you looking, being looked at, falling in or not, being resonated by these holes, being dripped on or not by the pipe that leaks from the ceiling every 20 minutes. Yeah, I don't have, do you, any specific questions more around the surveillance?
No, I mean, I think that answers my question. I mostly just wanted to hear you talk a bit more about how that played into what you were exploring in the installation. But that was helpful to hear as well. And I did see another question get asked, so I'll go ahead and ask you this one before we close out the Q&A. This time from Jarell in the audience. Thank you, Jarell. I'd be curious to know how Candice thinks of building narrative across media and modes, thinking of the linear and textual storytelling in the texts, but also the environmental and non-linear storytelling in the sculptural or installation elements. How do the two engage with one another or complicate each other?
I mean, I think in my installation, I'm always trying to think about different temporalities kind of spatially existing in one space. So that's both like historical, that's like the narrative of the story, that's the experience of like your body in relationship to these materials and what you're feeling in that exact moment. And I think I hope that they kind of like nest in together in a way for an experience that is the whole thing. Yeah. The question, sorry, specifically around how those,
How they complicate each other, maybe, or how they engage with one another.
yeah, I don't know how they complicate. I think maybe maybe it's done with the hope that then when you're outside of the installation, you're also like continuing to have a material experience with your body, and maybe that makes you think about those other narratives that maybe you don't normally. So maybe it's a way of trying to like make that experience be continuous with the world.
Thank you so much
Yeah,
for that question, Jarell. Oh, sorry, Andrew, please.
oh no, I just want to jump in, something I meant to get to and forgot to bring up, but that like I that was the part for me that didn't feel like science fiction or speculative fiction. Like I think about that often is if you get outside of the aesthetic of science fiction, something I always appreciate is as a literary form, it's oftentimes something from the deep past, something from the present, something from the future. Like three different stories, all by the end of the novel, kind of converge and make sense in relationship to each other. And I really like that it is that separate temporality shifting that then you see through it. Um, and Chloe, like going off of the sparseness of the supervisor station, for those of you who haven't seen the show yet, I also, that triggered kind of a postmodern sublime in me too, of like You know, like it's like the person in charge has like a worse office than like a break room, you know, like there is no like better office somewhere or more sense somewhere to how things are run. It's like it's just an empty space with kind of bad carpet, you know. Like I thought that was really wonderful as a decision.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Candice. I am getting so many great questions. I'm going to ask one more, and then we'll turn to our concluding poetry reading. Yin has a great question. Yin, if you'd like to unmute and ask directly, I'll give you the chance to. If not, I'm happy to read your question on your behalf.
Hi, thank you so much. Before I start, Candice, when you said that you're like beautiful with the woo woo, me too. I literally like air punch the air because, you know, metaphysical divinity, it's in us, it's within us. It's written within our bodies, especially, you know, as Asian people. Okay, question time. I wrote, your answers were divine. Thank you so much for your vulnerability, artistic integrity, and solidarity with Asian women's bodies, organic materials, earthly entanglements, and the divine messages in your dreams. Audre Lorde in page 84 of Sister Outsider said, "If I read things that were assigned, I didn't read them the way we were supposed to. Everything was like a poem with different curves, different levels. Have you resonated with this in your work, especially pursuing a double minor?"
Definitely. Not
Yes,
necessarily related
please
to
tell me more.
yeah, not necessarily related to the double minor or major, but yeah, I think yeah, like I mean, so I grew up kind of reading a lot of Gothic novels, overly young probably, and not watching TV. So I think I always read things in this way where like anytime I read a science text, I'd be like, what a fascinating story, instead of being like, wow, what facts those are or something. I think I always was kind of aware that the thing being imparted to me came enclosed in its own kind of framing, and that the framing itself was like a really interesting story to look at. And I think a lot of that, partly it came maybe from having that my first introduction to pop culture be through a lens that looks at it like that, through analysis and not as a given, the frame and not the content necessarily, you know, looking at the frame first, not the content. But I think part of that is also just like maybe upbringing, like you grow up with immigrant parents and you're decoding the world to tell it to them, to help them navigate as you are also kind of between worlds. So there's this element of not taking things as like legible or transparent or as on the surface, but that there's always a read that's being translated. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that question, Yin. And thank you for that answer, Candice. And thank you all so much for all of your questions tonight. They were great, and a huge thank you again to Candice and Andrew for tonight's conversation. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading, and today I'm thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the day, Larissa Pham, to the stage. Larissa Pham is an artist and writer in New York. She writes fiction, essays, and criticism, and is the author of Fantasian, a novella, and Pop Song, an essay collection, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Larissa.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Thank you also, Candice and Andrew, for letting us all eavesdrop on this wonderful conversation. I'm coming out of like this 5-day meditation retreat. It was just really nice to be surrounded by like lots of conversation and talking about art. So today is the continuation of a global strike called for by Palestinians to just draw attention to the war in Gaza. So I wanted to acknowledge that. And I wanted to acknowledge the war in Gaza and the war that is happening upon Gaza and this genocide that is currently happening, which is enabled by billions of American dollars and funded by American taxpayers. And I also wanted to just bring some numbers into the room with us. As of today, over 18,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza and the West Bank. Nearly 8,000 of them have been children. More than 50,000 Palestinians have been injured, disabled, and maimed. These numbers feel nearly incomprehensible, and I bring them in this room not to confront us with this problem of scale, but to force us to interpret it and inhabit it and not turn away from it. And I also want to just encourage us all in this moment to turn towards this pain and apprehend it across physical and psychological distance. And in turning toward it, I want us to consider how we are moved and how we must be moved and how we cannot be anything but moved, perhaps, and how we can look into our own lives and the positions of power we might occupy, maybe as taxpayers or as constituents or as voters, but also as artists and writers and people living in community with others, to call for an end to this violence. And while I have the mic, I'm going to read one poem that I wrote, and then I'm going to read a poem by the Palestinian poet Musab Abu Toha, and a poem by the Palestinian poet Rafat al-Arir, who was killed along with his family in a targeted airstrike by the Israeli army on December 7th. So that was 5 days ago. And I'll start with this poem, which is this is the one poem that I wrote. Maybe 10 years ago, I washed my hair in the river. It was May in Oregon, a hot day, but the river cold up to my thighs. I leaned over to rinse the soap out, sinking my hair into the water, weight of it pulling heavy. At the roots, I threw my head back, shaking like a dog. And then I felt it tug, insistent, anxious as a lover, a line connecting me to someone's pole, someone's rod. The hook had gone inside my body and come out again, the end of it shining in the sun. My friend caught the line, wire thin, nearly invisible, arcing like a ray of light, held it so I wouldn't tear, but there was no blood. After we laughed, pitched our tents, piled into sleeping bags, my hair dried of river water, I was surprised. I never felt it, not the hook, only the pull, never the pain, just the call. It could have ripped me open, but maybe that's it. Sometimes when given a choice to feel or not feel, feels the same. That night, even though our tents were pitched, we slept outside, the smell of sage heavy in the air, and the sky lightened, the way the sky lightens when no one's looking, gradually in increments, moving through all the colors without names. And this is a poem by Musab Abu Toha. It's called Things You May Find Hidden in My Ear. It's for Alicia M. Quinnell, MD. 1. When you open my ear, touch it gently. My mother's voice lingers somewhere inside. Her voice is the echo that helps recover my equilibrium when I feel dizzy during my attentiveness. You may encounter songs in Arabic, poems in English I recite to myself, or a song I chant to the chirping birds in our backyard. When you stitch the cut, don't forget to put all these back in my ear. Put them back in order as you would do with books on your shelf. 2. The drone's buzzing sound of an F-16, the screams of bombs falling on houses, on fields, and on bodies of rockets flying away. Rid my small ear canal of them all. Spray the perfume of your smiles on the incision. Inject the song of life into my veins to wake me up. Gently beat the drum so my mind may dance with yours, my doctor, day and night. And this last poem is by Rifat Al-Arir, called If I Must Die. If I must die, you must live, to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a tale. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so, so much, Larissa. That was such a beautiful and moving reading. Thank you so much for closing us out today with your words, and those words, they were amazing. And thank you so much again to Candice and Andrew. Thank you to Hannah at Cultural Council and to the team at Canal Projects for their support in preparing for today's event. Thanks as well to the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor this program and make daily conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rails fundraising right now to directly support our writers, our guest artists, our production staff, and our operations for the coming year. As a small nonprofit, we encourage you to donate at the link in the chat to help us meet our goal. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for Sea Fires Now Against Genocidal Poetics, a Rail reading curated by Camelia Omema Youssef and featuring readings by Anaïs Duplan, Daniel Mate, Cedar Saigo, Fargo Nassim Jbaki, and Mohammed Zania. You can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so, so much for joining us today and for being in this space with us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Hello.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Candice.
so much.
Thank you, Candice.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Candice.
Larissa's wonderful poetry. It was
Thank
so
you,
good.
Candice.
Beautiful.
Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
for a beautiful night.
Take care, everyone.
Congratulations on the show, Candice. Everyone go see it while you still can.
Larissa, that
Thank you,
reading was so
Chloe.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Candice. Thank you, Andrew. And Candice,
Thank you.
enjoy the rest of your afternoon and on the West Coast and that sun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.